Hey everyone, it's about 9:27 a.m. on this, or 9:28 a.m. on this Monday morning, October 13th, 2025. It is about 58 degrees to 59 degrees outside right now, and it's a nice and partly cloudy day on the West Coast. But before I start this video, I want you guys to all do me a solid favor, please, and that is to like the video, ring the bell for notifications, subscribe to the channel, and share the video. It would be greatly appreciated. Also, click on the links in the description to find my content elsewhere outside of YouTube. You can find my BW Ross's discussions, my BW Ross's discussions on all your favorite audio and video podcast platforms like Spotify, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Pandora, to an extent SiriusXM, Radio Public. Wherever there is a podcast or a variety of podcasts to be listened to, more than likely you'll find mine there as well. Also, do me a solid favor and click on my fourth wall store. I only have one bit of merchandise right now. The link is on the top of the description. I have one bit of merchandise there right now, but there will be more to come. And also go to the bottom to the Teespring store. I have a lot of stuff there if you want to look into. Click on the link there. It'd be greatly appreciated. Also, you can support me over at patreon.com. It'd be greatly appreciated there. I'm going to try to do something there in the near future. Things don't go the way I'm hoping, and hoping they will, and I believe God's gonna make that possibility a reality. I really do. But also, like I said, support me over at Patreon. Be greatly appreciated. I do have plans for that, and also support me at Venmo and Cash App. It'd be greatly appreciated there too. And do me a solid favor, guys. During this premiere, you can go to the SuperChats. If you want to, go to the live chat and say hello and donate if you want. Whatever amount you could do would be greatly appreciated. But yeah, the super chats are open, and then after the premiere is over of this video, you can click on the link, or click on the super thanks link, the heart with the dollar sign in the middle, the super thanks link there. It'd be greatly appreciated if you do that, as well as go to the shop area and check out some of the items I have linked up, at various areas where you can purchase them, even some major retailers, as well as comment down below with your thoughts. But with that said, guys, let's get into the topic of this video, shall we? Okay, guys, so on Saturday, Firebrand, Josh Scorcher, gave us all a pleasant surprise when he uploaded his first MLP review video in about 3 years. You see, the last MLP related video he did was his review on Gen 5's movie New Generation. Now, I'm certain that he probably did watch, him and his wife Aramount probably did watch Make Your Mark and Tell Your Tale, because according to the promotional works, you have to watch both to connect the overall story. I'm pretty sure they watched all of that, and it's probably on his checklist, if you will, of reviews he's got to get done so people can hear his thoughts, on the whole series, overall. But also, let's not kid ourselves, he's done plenty of reviews on G4, but it's not all the episodes. He did a video basically ranking, in 5 words or less, a lot of the songs, in MLP, which is over like 200 plus songs or something like that. I'm not really sure. So basically he did that video and everything, which I have to give him, a lot of praise for, but I have to give him a lot of praise and respect for doing. But like I said, the last one he truly did was was on screen, believe it or not, as himself with Gen 5. Now, he has done some other MLP stuff on his Josh Scorcher channel in the past, but he's now dedicated that mostly to being a gaming channel where he does Let's Plays and reaction videos to, State of Plays and Nintendo Directs and, so on. And yeah, that's about it. And outside of that, he's also primarily, like I said, done things with Faber Questia that are non-MLP. The ones that he's done that's non-MLP outside of yesterday, and then the one he did 3 years prior. Well, not yesterday, but Saturday, and then the one 3 years prior. Outside of that, he's dedicated about three of the upload slots there, or recent upload slots there, to two top 10 Bluey videos. One was episodes and then the other was morals, and they had Voice of Reason as part of that. And then in between those, he did a review, or after the moral one, the top 10 Bluey morals, if you will, he did his review on Shinbone Alley, which is a early 1970s animated classic, underrated animated classic, starring Carol Channing. But anyway, after that, we didn't know whether or not we were going to get another Blu-ray review or another movie review. But much to our surprise, the next review we got was MLP related, but mostly for Gen 1. It was mostly a Gen 1 review, and his take, his take and overall thoughts on the Gen 1 animated special pilots. The first one that came out in '84, which was Rescue/Escape, from or at Midnight Castle. And then the other one being, which actually celebrates 40 years this year, the second one celebrates 40 years this year, Escape at or from Katerina. Now, the one thing he said in his thumbnail, because he had an image of both the G1 version of T-Rex and then, of course, Katerina, who I don't think we've ever gotten a G4 or G5 version of. Although I think the later villainess, the Eliora or whatever her name is, I think she is kind of based on the character and personality-wise. Maybe. I'm not really sure. But anyway, though, he did his take on it. He did his review, gave his thoughts on it, and you can hear the genuine, surprise, because of course he had to watch the specials to kind of, to basically do the review, right? But you could see hear the genuine surprise in his voice, and even the animated reactions of his Pony OC Firebrand when he was talking about, about the specials and how surprisingly dark they were. And I think that's the one thing people, that grew up post-1980s and even post-1990s seem to underestimate about those time frames. And even the early to mid-2000s, I will give a little leeway to, because they had a few, not a lot, but a few very rare over-the-air syndicated dark cartoons, that were aired on Saturday mornings. Those being, in my opinion, the 2K TMNT, as well as the soft rebooted continuation of Biker Mice, along with a few others. The other dark cartoons that were out at that time were primarily only seen, especially as you got later on in the 2000s, later seen only on cable, like Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon and so on. But to get back on topic, though, like I said, hearing his genuine surprise, in his review and everything about how dark Gen 1 was, especially with the first animated pilot, which was Escape, like I said, which was Escape/Rescue at from Midnight Castle. Again, like I said, people seem to underestimate the 80s and to an extent the 90s and even the early to mid 2000s, but mostly the 80s and 90s. And if I was to basically really be truthful with you, the 80s to the 70s, or 70s to the 80s, or 70s to the early to mid 90s, basically that 20 to 25 years time frame or time span. If I'm going to be real with you. Because, you'll look at a lot of rebooted stuff based on some classic stuff from back then. You're probably thinking, oh, whatever version they had back then pales in comparison to this. There's no way anything they had back then could be, as dark or intense or as mature as what we're getting here with this incarnation. And then what happens? They go and check out the OG versions from the 80s, from the 90s somewhat, as well as even the 70s. And they're basically taken aback. They're like, oh my gosh, this is a lot darker, a lot more mature than I thought. And the reason for that, and again, this is the one thing that they underestimate, if you will. The one main thing for that is in that time frame of the 70s, 80s, and early to mid 90s, and somewhat carried on into the 2000s, but not as much. Like I said, like I mentioned, in my opinion, there were a few rare exceptions, if you will. There were a few rare exceptions, here and there. Like I said, with TMNT, Biker Mice, and I'll even say Sonic X, even the dub version of Sonic X, if you will, and especially the latter seasons, like the final season was more darker than I think anybody expected. But still, with a few exceptions, even then, and into the 2010s and even now, you don't see, many things be as dark You don't see many things being as dark as they were back in the 80s, 70s, and early to mid 90s, or throughout the 90s as well, because that sense of freedom, that sense of freelancing and being having a little more leeway and everything to do to get as creative as you could to help bring these stories and bring these characters to life and the atmospheres they were in to life. It's not there anymore. It's not there anymore unless you're going to have the show premiere exclusively on a streaming platform like, let's say, Netflix or HBO Max or Disney Plus, Hulu on Disney Plus, you know, Paramount, Crunchyroll, you name it. That's the only way you're going to be able to kind of reignite or find or refine and reignite that old nostalgic feel that you had growing up back in the 80s and the 70s and the 90s. That's the only way you're going to get that back is by and even here on YouTube and Rumble and VENMO and all that. That's the only way you're going to get that back. Because basically even with YouTube, despite their algorithm and all that, you're able to have a lot more freedom. You're able to do a lot more, here and there. Like I said, with a few exceptions, algorithms and certain, things you got certain like rules you got to follow, especially if you want to monetize. But still, you're able to get away with a lot more than you could on over the air or even, to an extent, cable television. Same with, like I said, the streaming platforms that I mentioned. And that's why when you look at a lot of the shows that go on there, from studios like, like Visipop Studios or Glitch Studios or wherever, a lot of these indie studios that are growing, when you see a lot of them being picked up by these bigger platforms, and one of the things contractually they put in there is, hey, we want to have final say on how the episode goes, and so that it's able to stay as it's originally meant to stay or be. That's why you see them, and you get that, especially if you grew up in the 80s and 90s and 70s and all that, and 2000s, but mostly 80s and 90s and 70s, you get that familiar, nostalgic feel when you watch these shows because it reminds you of that. It reminds you of that time frame. And again, that's the one thing people seem to underestimate. They seem to underestimate or not understand as to, why these kind of shows are able to do that on these streaming platforms, but not on cable television or even over the air. And it's mostly due to the fact that they're, over the air and cable wise, like, yeah, they are kind of loosening some restrictions. They are loosening some restrictions, but not all of them. Which is why you're still not able to get like the full context of what you want unless you're watching really late at night and everything, because that's the only time some of these restraints are off. But basically, this is why, when they see, shows like Digital Circus or Hell of a Boss or Has Been Hotel or Lackadaisy, and so on, it has that old school feel. It's mostly a and they're wondering why does it feel like, because I'm sure they watch a lot of shows back then, from back then, and see the difference in tone, and then when they watch these newer shows from the independent studios, they're like, why does it have that familiar tone of something back in the 80s or 70s or whatever? It's mainly because it's created by those that grew up in that time frame. And again, that's the one thing, as I was alluding to before getting off track a little bit. That's what I was alluding to as to why people underestimate or not understand how back then we were able to get away with a lot more in what we saw. Which is why, MLP, as I checked something here, guys, MLP was, able to, be as dark as it was in the two animated specials, Return, Rescue from Midnight Castle, as well as Escape at or from Katarina. They were able to get that dark. They were able to get that dark somewhat to an extent in the movie, and even in the series they got dark. I mean, come on, there are some episodes, multi-part episodes, to where basically you had, ponies get turned to crystal, and yeah, they got restored and everything, but the way it was done, and then the way certain things would happen afterwards, you would think some of those ponies in the crystal form, or in prison crystal form, got shattered, if you will. You weren't sure, but you weren't sure until you would watch the following day and see, those ponies are okay, they're fine. But you also had an episode where you had a witch basically stealing the youth from ponies, and of course that's the time we got introduced to the Big Brother ponies, but still, you had that happening, and you really wouldn't see something like that happening that day, today. Now, as much, unless, like I said, it's on a show that's on a streaming platform. because you can get away with a lot more then. But the point is, back then, like I said, point is back then, you know, things were a lot different. They were a lot different, which is why Gen 1 was as dark as it was, not just with the specials and the movie, but to an extent with the movie, but also with the series. That's why they were able to get away with what they did. And they weren't the only show, that Hasbro had that, they were trying to push, the boundaries with. Of course, you had Transformers and everything, even from the get-go, and especially with the movie and afterwards, Gen 1 of Transformers, and even G.I. Joe. Even when they switched studios from Sunbow to DIC to finish up, the G1 version of G.I. Joe, still they pushed limits, they pushed limitations, they went in directions you would not expect them to go in, even nowadays. And again, the only way you'd be able to get away with the G.I. Joe wise nowadays in animated form is to basically put it on either late at night, like they did, or make it a web exclusive, series, like they did, let's say G.I. Joe Resolute, or put it on late at night, if you will. Which, by the way, you can watch G.I. Joe Resolute now on the channel. And why it's listed as a kids thing, because they turned off the comments, I don't know why. It's not meant for kids. I don't know. But point is though, you could watch it. That's what I'm trying to say. You could watch it. But when that first came out, they put it on, as a Cartoon Network Toonami, late night thing, exclusive on their web page, and then they would show the episodes late at night on Toonami, on the adult version, the Adult Swim version of Toonami, or at least Adult Swim at that time. So basically that'd be the only way you'd be able to see this kind of stuff. Even today. But back then, like I said, all those kind of Hasbro shows, even Gem and the Holograms, they weren't as violent, but they had very mature themes that you wouldn't even think about would be seen today. They had, like I said, unless the thing was on a streaming platform. But yeah, they had some very mature themes even back then, with Gem and the Holograms. So again, the time frame obviously is a big difference. The time frame is a big difference, because when you look again at how dark of all things MLP was, compare it to Friendship is Magic, and Friendship is Magic had its moments. Don't get me wrong, the Twilight Tirek battle, in the finale for season 4 is a big example of how intense and crazy they can get, as well as even the series finale itself. Basically the ending of the end finale, or somewhat well, I guess you could say it was a 3-parter or something. I'm not really sure, but basically the ending of the end climax battle and all that and everything that took place, you could see that they got intense as well. But again, it was the finale, so I guess they can get away with it and have a little bit more leeway because of that. But still, people would say that when you compare that to what you would see with the pilot, the one that started it all back in '84, people would be like, that's night and day. Like, it's nothing compared to the pilot. Like, the pilot is way darker in its aspect, and it is. It really is, if you will. I mean, it's intense, it's dark. I mean, even Firebrand, Josh even said in his review that it felt like somebody's dark 80s fantasy film special or story or whatever. That's what it felt like to him. When he was reviewing it. And again, like I said earlier, you could hear the genuine surprise in his review. Like, he couldn't. As I check something here, guys, like, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He couldn't believe, what he was seeing for himself, especially when it came to this being MLP, at least the origins of MLP. And one person even commented in the comment section, think about being a mom, here in the States and across the ocean in the UK and so on. Think about it. You're a mom. You're, at that time frame, probably a grandma or great-grandma now. No offense. But think about it. You're a mom. You're seeing this. You're thinking, I'm going to rent this for my daughter because your daughter wants it, who's now maybe a mom, grandmother herself. Again, no offense. But they see it, they want to rent it. And your mom, like, okay, I'll rent it. It's My Little Pony, it's cute and everything. Imagine renting it, if you haven't seen it on television by that time, popping it in, and then all of a sudden, as you're watching it, here come the ponies. Right off the bat, here comes a bunch of dragons, led by a demon transformed prince who's enslaved and everything. Imagine seeing that right off the get go and going like, wait a minute, this is My Little Pony? Like, what the heck? And then later on seeing three ponies, and then later on a fourth one, the OG Applejack, if you will, being turned into mindless dragonal beast, to carry the original T-Rex, chariot. I'm trying to find the right word to say, chariot, throughout the sky. Imagine what's going through your mind. You're thinking at first, oh, it's going to be harmless, it's going to be like Winnie the Pooh and all that. And then suddenly you see that, you're like, what the heck is going on here? Like, what did I rent? And it's the same thing, basically, believe it or not, with Transformers the movie back in '86. Nobody expected that movie to be as dark and violent as it was, but much to a lot of people surprised it was. And it caused a lot of trauma. It caused a lot of childhood trauma, but still, it was dark. It surprised a lot of folks. But again, like I said, that's because even back then, in the '80s, the timeline was different. Well, not timeline, but the era, basically, the time frame and everything was different, if you will, when it came to being able to get away with what you were able to get away with. And like I said, unless you have some kind of agreement in place to where it's like, yeah, the uncut version can only be seen, via streaming platforms or buying it digitally or waiting for the physical release, on home media, unless the agreement is, yeah, you can put the episode on, but it's going to be edited and everything, then the cut is, as I mentioned, that would be the only way it could be seen. I'm trying to find the right way to say it, guys. Basically, you couldn't get away with that kind of stuff today. You couldn't really get away with it unless it's a movie. That's an exception. You can get away with it if it's a movie. That's one thing. You can get away with it if it's a movie. But also, like I said, if it's only like a streaming series, if it's meant for streaming and all that. But yeah, again, you can't blame Firebrand, Josh Scorcher, for being genuinely surprised by how dark it was, especially with some of the things that were happening. Basically, in Escape from Katarina, the way that ends is you have basically Katarina threatening, if you will, threatening to basically. She's threatening to, basically, hold on for a second, guys. Sorry about that, guys. I was just checking something. But anyway, like I said, basically, you wouldn't be able to get away with that kind of stuff unless, like I said, the agreement was essentially, have it aired, edited on television, and then watch it, uncut either on the streaming platform or buying it, digitally or physically later on. That would be the only way. But again, like I said, you listen to Firebrand, Josh Scorcher's genuine, surprise, and like I said, it was dark. It was very dark, believe it or not, because, basically he even said that the darkest it got with Katarina, the darkest it got with Katarina was you had Katarina, basically, and I was trying to say this before I had to go take care of something. But with Katarina, the way it ends is you have Katarina threatening to kill the G1 version of Moondancer, and that's enough for basically her boyfriend or whatever he is to be like, nope, that's over the line. He's and he's a shapeshifter, a shape-shifting lizard, so he's able to basically become a bull, push her into basically what would be the pit to where she makes her witchery potion, as she calls it. And essentially, he's telling her, look, I'll save you, because she's asking him to save her. And he's like, I'll save you, but I don't want you to be this way anymore. I need you to be the old girl that I fell in love with. The Katarina that, fell in love with me, and so on. So she agrees to do it. She agrees to do that and everything in an ironic kind of twisted way, because she still has to take the potion to get her magic to destroy the device that's giving her the potion or making the potion for her. But still, it's like, again, you could see that you could see why the time frame, the time difference was so different, if you will. It was so different between what you see nowadays and then, because again, you could get away with a lot more then than you could now. I mean, even with adult animation back in the 70s and somewhat 80s, early 80s, you had to basically The only way you could ever get it seen in theaters, if possible, was to be given an X rating or an NC-17 rating, and that'd be the only way you can get it in theaters, if at all. And the only way you could show it in theaters was to have it shown late at night, basically like in the final showings of the theater, for the theater before it closed down for the day. So yeah, even with adult animation, they had to really they were able, I should say, to get away with what they wanted or get away with what they had, but even they had to follow certain restrictions. Like they either had to accept, hey, you're going to be limited to very, very, very late night showings or underground showings and da 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 da, or you're just going to have to just put it directly on television late at night or direct to video, whatever the case might be. But again, the time frame, the time difference, between now, what you're seeing now, and even back when Friendship is Magic started, and then is basically night and day. It really is. It is completely like night and day. So, yeah, overall, basically, again, when you watch his review, and I know this is a lot longer than his review, this response that is, but you watch Firebrand Josh Sculptor's review, you can't help but agree with him on that, especially with his genuine response in his review. Because basically, when you think of My Little Pony back then, the first thing you're thinking is, oh, it's nothing compared to what Friendship is Magic was. Friendship is Magic was a lot more intense, a lot more mature, and a lot more darker at times. But then you see how it all began with Gen 1, basically for the franchise as a whole, and it takes you aback. You're taken aback, by that. And so, yeah, I don't blame him for having that kind of response. I don't blame anybody, that didn't, watch, the original animated pilots that began, that started it all for MLP. I don't really blame them for being as surprised, by the darkness, not just in tone and everything, in potential intensity and everything, and violence, but also in dialogue. I mean, the fact that you had the original T-Rex threaten Scorpan, hey, if you don't get me a fourth pony, which turned out to be Applejack, to be turned into another dark dragon, it's like, if you don't do that and everything, then the head of your friend, your OG Spike, is going to roll. He basically is telling him, hey, you don't do what I say, I'm going to decapitate you, I'm going to cut your friend's head off, and everything. And here's the thing. The closest we got to something like a callback, the closest we got to a callback to that was basically during the climax, the final battle climax in the finale for Friendship is Magic, when they basically told Twilight, when you had the three villains tell Twilight, stand down, let us destroy you, or else we're going to rip off his wings. Or basically have her stand down, denounce friendship, or they're going to rip off Spike's wings. And again, that's the closest you would get from to a callback to to basically the pilot, the OG pilot, if you will, which was again surprisingly dark. But like I said, those that didn't grow up with the OG versions back in the 80s, nor did they if they ever saw the replays when they got replayed in syndication, and then believe it or not on Disney Channel, when Disney Channel had the licensing rights to them, because they also had the licensing rights to the Gen 2, and that's what I'm looking at as Gen 2 My Little Pony Tales. Basically, it's like if you didn't see it at any time and you're just getting caught up to it now. Hold on for a second, guys. Sorry about that, guys. The phone rang there. But like I said, basically, even with the dialogue and everything, and like I said, the closest we got as a callback is when you had Chrysalis basically threaten to have, you had Chrysalis and T-Rex and Cozy Glow threaten to rip off Spike's wings unless, Twilight and the rest of the main six stood down, basically surrendered, gave up, if you will, and everything, and maybe even denounced friendship to prove them right. That's the closest as a callback, because they didn't say, you don't do this, his head's gonna roll. They didn't do that. They said, we'll rip off his damn wings, and everything, which which isn't basically like a killing blow and all that, but basically would be a very injury prone, very like it's going to take a long time to recover from that kind of situation. But again, like I said, you could tell the difference, even if you have something that looks like a callback and everything, if you will. And what's crazy too about season 9's finale and everything, it had callbacks. Believe it or not, it had some callbacks to the original OG pilot. When you think about it, it really did. But point I'm getting at is instead of going that route, they went a different route, which, like I said, was a callback. I know I'm repeating myself here. I do apologize. But anyway, overall, in closing, I don't want this to get too longer than what it is. In closing, basically, the review I thought was great. I thought the review on both specials was great. And again, you could hear the genuine surprise and reaction as he's recording the review in Josh Scorcha Firebrand's voice. You could hear it. Because, again, for those that didn't catch it originally, like I did and others did, it will be a surprise. Because, again, you could think, MLP was, Friendship is Magic was dark and intense and more mature. But when you see how it all began, you basically get, like I said earlier, you get taken aback. You're like, wait a minute. That's how it all began? That's how this whole thing started? Man, that's even darker than what we've seen in Friendship is Magic, even with the finale. Or the final conflict, if you will, the final climax, if you will, between the main six and the trio, and the villainous trio, if you will. Sorry, just hold on for a sec. Sorry about that. I almost had a brain fart. I had to stop for a second. But like I said, people would look at that and be like, that's more darker than even with the final conflict between the villainous trio and the main six and Spike, or the main seven, if you will. If you want to include Spike in there. But anyway, get to the point. Get to the point, basically. Get to the point, Brian. People don't want this to go too long. But anyway, like I said, in closing, basically, like I mentioned, the review was great. You got to check it out. And again, this should basically prove to you, or to anybody listening and watching, that you should not underestimate, the difference in presentation based on the time frame. Because just because you think something might be cute and cuddly, and it might be for most of the part, it could surprise you. It could really surprise you. And MLP definitely fit that bill right from the beginning. And like I said, it shows you that the 80s, the 70s, mostly the 90s, but I would say more so early to mid-90s and everything, it shows you how different of a time that was, to where, nowadays the only way you can get away with having things, as you want them to be meant to be seen is through streaming, like through, video outlets and streaming outlets like YouTube, HBO Max, Disney Plus, Netflix, you name it, Amazon Prime, you name it. That's the only way. Because outside of that, if you wanted to try to get it on regular television, cable or over the air, you'd have to tone some things down and then tell people, hey, go watch the uncut version here and you'll get the full context. You get the full context. But like I said, in closing, it shows you that the time frame was different between, those 25 years, those 25 years of basically the beginning of the 70s up to about 95. It shows you how different the time frame was, due to the fact that they were able to get away with a lot more. Hasbro was able to get away with a lot more. Disney, to an extent, was able to get away with a lot more. Warner Brothers and so on. Any studio that had a Geek Entertainment, DIC, and Hanna-Barbera, they were able to get away with a lot more. Basically, to an extent. Excuse me. They were able to get away with a lot more. And all because of the fact that they had more leeway, they had more freedom. And this was all before the FCC and mostly the parental groups started to really push. And you noticed this in the mid to late 90s, started to really push more of that educational presentation onto everybody, more so than ever before. I mean, yeah, you got it in the 80s with the PSAs and stuff and all that after the shows, but still, it's like, it's like a lot of people have said that grew up at that time frame and it had the opportunity even afterwards from the 80s and mostly through the 90s and 2000s and all that to grow up with Saturday morning cartoons. A lot of people have said, they would watch Saturday morning cartoons to get away from education, to have a break from education, but yet you had this, this board basically saying, no, you're still going to have education given to you. And that pretty much was the downplay of Saturday mornings, but still. Point is, you could see the difference. You could see the difference in time frame. You could see that difference, like I said, in the presentations and everything in those 25 years, in my opinion, from my point of view, from 1970 to 1995. You could see that. You could see that difference in tone in presentation with Saturday morning cartoons. That difference in tone when it comes to weekday morning and weekday afternoon cartoons. When it comes to Sunday morning cartoons, you could see that difference in tone. And the only way you can recapture that magic, if you will, is to watch it via streaming or on nostalgic-like networks, like, let's say, MeTV Tunes, and so on. Which I'm guaranteeing you, Wagler Broadcasting had to sign some waivers and agreements, taking responsibility for whatever, controversies they may get by showing certain classic cartoons and everything, in the uncut, uncensored form, if you know what I mean. But in closing, guys, and I know I was all over the place here, I do apologize. This is what happens when you do, because I'm known for this, you know that. Being uncut and unscripted and just, doing things off the top of your head, saying things off the top of your head. But in closing, guys, I just wanted to do this video, give my response to Josh's Firebrands review of the first Gen 1 specials, the first two anyway, and the latter, like I say, the Katarina one, celebrating 40 years this year. But give me your take. If you haven't done it already in the live chat and everything, give me your take and everything in the comment section. Let me know what your thoughts are. How do you feel about, what did you, well, okay, let me correct myself. What did you think when you first saw these specials with Gen 1? If you saw them like way after they debuted, like maybe when you were, let's say you were born in the 90s or the 2000s, let me know what your thoughts were when you first found out about the Gen 1 specials, and how did you react when you saw how dark they could get, especially with the movie and the series that followed? Let me know. And let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and everything down below in the comments and everything, in the comment section and all that. But let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts and everything. Because again, I'm sure when you look at the difference, yeah, like I said, Friendship is Magic could be intense. There's no doubt. But it pales in comparison to what some of the things you would get in Gen 1. Let's be honest. And again, like I said, this is a time frame where even, shows that I grew up with, and I was mostly in the boy shows at times. I would only watch the girl shows if I had no other choice and it was raining outside, and everything. But still, the point is, but the point is, what I'm getting at, I'm trying to not get tongue-tied here, but the point I'm getting at is, I could, honestly, you could, from experience, I could tell you, personal experience, I could tell you, the tone was a lot different. So give me your thoughts. How did you feel about it? Let me know down below in the comments and everything. And do me again, guys, a solid favor, like I said at the beginning. Like the video, ring the bell for notifications, subscribe to the channel, also share the video, and click on the links to find my content elsewhere, as well as to support me in the various areas there. It would be greatly appreciated. But again, guys, I do apologize in closing if I was all over the place. Basically, it's like I said, when you do these things uncut, unscripted, and on the fly, and basically just thinking about what you're going to say off the top of your head without bullet points, it's just one of those things. Like, one of the people I follow here on YouTube, JD, JD from NY206. You just go with the flow. You go with the flow. You let them see the genuine you, and you just let it. You just see what they have to say about it, and see if they'll follow you and take what you have to say seriously or in consideration. But guys, let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know what your thoughts are on what I had to say here. And Josh, if you're watching, I will tag you basically here on YouTube, as well as I'll probably send it to you via Twitter/X. Let me know what your thoughts are. Comment down below, guys. Like the video. And until next time, I am out. Take care. God bless.